Dr. Hlophe claims his impeachment was political, saying his proximity to former President Jacob Zuma led to his persecution. Hlophe says anyone and everyone who is associated with the former president is treated unfairly. He has been sworn in as an MK Party member of Parliament. Dr. Hlophe says he was removed from his position like a dog.
I had lost my job as a judge because of politics. The decision to impeach me was a political decision. I said it before I was impeached, and I maintain that. There was no law that was ever used there. It was politics, and I do believe that the fact that I was perceived as being closely associated with President Zuma is another reason for the decision that was taken. And I think if you look around in the country, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that a lot of people who were closely aligned to President Zuma have been persecuted in this country. You don't have to be a genius to see that. There is a clear trend that if you are regarded as a Zuma fan, you get persecuted in this country.
All right, let's have a conversation now with political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I'll start right at the back of that interview that my colleague Bulelani Philip had with Dr. John Hlophe. He says that, if you are seen to be anywhere near the former president or share proximity with former President Jacob Zuma, you are likely to be treated unfairly. He says that he was kicked out of his position like a dog. I wonder, what did you make of some of the remarks that he had to make today?
Well, I think the impeachment process is a very extensive one, especially for judges, and two of them have been affected by that. It started with the Judicial Service Commission, which is a very diverse body, consists of a diverse number of members, members of Parliament, members from the Judicial Commission, community, practicing lawyers, and many others. So they made the recommendation to Parliament that the impeachment process must continue there, and Parliament with a majority voted in favor of that. So it is not just one particular political party or political tendency or group that voted in favor of that. That was a very extensive process. The reason why he was in that position was he became, as a judge, involved in the politics of President Zuma. That was the main accusation against him, that he tried to influence two judges of the Constitutional Court to make judgments in favor of President Zuma. And so therefore, to present that, I think is problematic, therefore.
At the same time, you see Zizikotwa, former minister, being sworn in, and he says that, of course, he had to come today because he had a family matter. And a number of people were surprised to see him being sworn in, given the recent developments around him being charged, etc. And he says that questions about, the step-aside rule of the ANC and everything else must be asked of the ANC. But he had to be sworn in as Member of Parliament so that he can start working in Parliament. Let's talk about right now, the process that unfolds, given the fact that he's been charged.
Yes, I think there's going to be two situations. The first one is now, and that is to what extent the step-aside rule is applicable to him. He stepped aside when he was charged, and then thereafter he had resigned as minister and as member of the ANC's National Executive Committee. So I think those steps that he took, to a large extent, in a sense, disqualified, not legally, but morally disqualified him from becoming a member of Parliament. I think if he is found guilty in this case, and if the sentence is more than 12 months, as we know now, the way in which it is implemented, or in the case of President Zuma, then he will be disqualified as a member of Parliament. Now, that's hypothetical, because he hasn't been found guilty, but that is the other option or possibility that might arise at some point in time. So I think his future as a member of Parliament for the ANC is therefore on a tenuous one. It's one on thin ice, and I guess that at some point he will actually leave Parliament.
And when we then shift gears slightly and look at the developments around the government of national unity, as some have called it, but others are saying for them it's a grand coalition. I wonder, what were your impressions when you saw that DA letter that has now been confirmed doing the rounds on social media and the demands that are contained there?
Well, we are at the phase of bargaining, of negotiations. At the same time, there were all the time new parties joining the government of national unity, and that influenced these bargaining processes, because what it did is that the two main parties, the ANC and the DA, and their presence or their representation in the different bodies, like, for example, cabinet and the deputy ministers and parliament, will be influenced by it. It's the number of seats available for these different. The big parties were automatically introduced to make room for these small parties. So I think they've now concluded that process. No new parties can join without a common consensus amongst them. And what we are seeing is sort of the latter parts of the negotiation process, that part which I would call the brinkmanship phase of negotiations, where all the different parties, and especially the main ones, the ANC and the DA, are pushing each other to the brink and see who's going to make the first concession. But it cannot last very long. So I think it's at some point, relatively soon, they are going to reach a point of saying, well, now we must conclude this and finalize the whole agreement about the government of national unity. So it's not at a point of risk, in my opinion. It's rather a point of the maximum type of bargaining that's taking place, and which is very, very conventional, very expected to a large extent of these type of negotiations.
So, of course, maybe try to push it as far as you can so that you get, more than possibly in some instances what you bargained for. But there's a part of the letter that is quite interesting. It talks about directors general reporting to DA ministers and selected by panels consisting of DA ministers, and then those names would be submitted to the president. They express concern that the individuals who are currently occupying the positions may not be amenable to take directions from DA ministers, especially given the ANC's cadre deployment policy. But if they are to sit on this panel, as including ministers then, and these are particular ministers who then be choosing these particular directors general, how different is that from what the ANC has been doing and what they've been accusing the ANC of doing?
Well, I think what the DA is presenting there is, to a large extent, unrealistic. It's not part of these negotiations. The negotiations, in my view, are about the seats in government. That means the executive cabinet, as well as the deputy ministers, as well as positions also in parliament. When one goes into the public sector in terms of senior officials, I think that is something that must follow much later on, and they can't negotiate about that now. And I think this is part of maybe over-presenting their case in order to put pressure on the ANC. But I can't see any agreement between the parties, specifically on the directors general and other senior persons in the public sector, who are not part of the executive.
So isn't that problematic, though, for it to be in the letter and also signaling that this is what they would want? Isn't it problematic because they accuse the ANC of cadre deployment? And to anyone reading that particular section, it may sound like they now want to do the same thing.
Yes, that is problematic in that sense, but it is conventional all over the world. When new governments come into power, let's say for argument's sake, President Trump wins the election in the US. He's going to do the same. The same is happening in most, about every country in the world, that senior officials ultimately are appointed by a new incoming government. So that's not strange. It is the cadre deployment was about the way in which it has been done and organized and formalized by the ANC over time. And the fact that they didn't use that the question about merit was maybe as important or less important than the party membership. So these are things, again, what I'm saying, that must be, it's not the time now to talk about these things. It must come afterwards. For the moment now, the negotiations must be focused, and it must be focused on a relatively small number of positions and not as widely spread as they do it. The DA has some strategy with it, and it's not necessarily to achieve what they are saying in a literal sense, but rather to try to also talk to different audiences. And sometimes it's their own members that they have in mind, and I think that is why it has been leaked, and not so much for the negotiation process itself.
Prof, it's going to be an interesting one, and as you say, that keep it small, but we're seeing quite a number of political parties are joining. So what does it mean, for the process going forward? But thank you so much for your time, and let's see how this all unfolds, and keen to hear your thoughts when we eventually get sight or even hear who is going to be making up part of this particular cabinet. That was a political analyst, Professor Dirk Kotze.